Good morning, everybody. It's August 3rd, 2020.
Good morning. 72, episode 72. We can take full Social Security now.
Mm-hmm. And this is episode 72. And I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. It's a beautiful Monday morning here. It's not hot.
Yeah, it's probably going to be around 72 today.
Yeah.
The temperature.
Yeah.
So it's like,
oh my gosh.
I mean, this is what I want summer to always be like. This is why I loved Ireland so much. Like, oh, this is where I should live in a place like that. Changing from pleasant things to unpleasant things. I'm going to dive right into it.
Is our want to do.
I mean, we're talking about this because it touches on so many other things, but like, basically, here's the story. I'm just going to, so there's this young woman, 31, Rene Bach, who right after high school started a missionary agency that offered charitable treatment for malnourished children in Uganda. She did it right after high school, so she had no medical training. And under her care, 105 children died.
Under her care,
and like,
care.
And like, you know, just so people know, because I know people's mind goes there, that's a lot of children. It's not like children just drop dead in Uganda at that high of rate. So this was well beyond the normal rates of death. And people testified that she was even like administering IVs and transfusions herself, which can cause death if you don't do it right. It's not like an easy slam dunk kind of thing to do, like putting on a fresh coat of paint. And so she was sued by people, and it was settled that she had to pay these 105 mothers $9,500 each. So that sum total is less than $1 million for full payout. And then after this, she has no, she gets off scot-free. Like there's no admission of guilt.
Right.
So there's so many dangling threads of shittiness off of this that we could use as self-reflection for our own society, but this is, yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, can we go protest at her house? Do we know where she lives?
I don't even know where she lives. I mean, there's just so much, like, here's the thing, like that's shitty, but she's not. The thing isn't that she seems like such a big monster to me. Is that she seems like a lot of people I know. That's right. Gus already commented, like, you two sound way too chipper considering the topic. My chipperness is the chipperness of like absurdity, because I know people like this Rene person.
Yes.
Like so many. Many. And then I've been a little bit like that, although I've always been too conflicted to go full religious sociopath on people. But she's a symptom of a much bigger problem. She's not some sort of outlying monster. To me, she is a case study of missions in my mind.
Yeah. So I'll tell my story of this. So I know this family here in Minnesota that considers themselves to be a good Minnesota family, coming out of this very fundamentalist church tradition. And one of the kids in this family, she and her husband are missionaries in Africa, and they tried to steal a child. So they tried to steal this little black kid, save him from Islam. And luckily, the family was able to, they kind of had to like kidnap the kid back. And all the while that they're trying to steal this kid, they're sending home pictures of the kid, and everybody's praying for the kid. They're praying for his salvation. They're praying that he gets to be with a good family. They're just so sad that he can't come home, with this good family, and moments of self-reflection about how completely insane this is. And so this is the narcissism of this form of Christianity. right, which connects to so many themes we've been talking about: American exceptionalism, racism, how we're dealing with the pandemic, the allegiance of the fundamentalist churches with Trump. This is full on toxic narcissism on display.
This reminds me. So the other day I got to preach virtually at Mills Church, which is in Minnetonka. They're a really cool church that, just as an aside, because I love this, traditional, independent, kind of fundamentalist church that started, but over the last decade or so, the pastor has raised questions about starting with women in ministry, and then LGBTQ inclusion, and the nature of imperialism. And so their church has whittled down smaller and smaller as they become more and more faithful. And so I got invited to talk about a gospel for white people, which is a lot of fun and very heavy. And in it, I talk about, one of the things I bring up is in the 1430s, I don't know if it was Pope Alexander, issued papal bull Dum Diversus, which basically says, hey, Portugal and Spain, if you go anywhere in the world where there are people who are Muslims or pagans, you can put them into perpetual servitude. Now we know that morphs. We've talked about this before, but when that kind of doctrine gets to the United States and Virginia in the 1600s, that shifts from non-Christians to non-white people. But this is the same kind of colonial logic, that somehow we can do whatever we want to other people's lives as long as we think it betters them. Because part of the logic of this, the rationalization for these papal decrees is, yes, being a slave is shitty, but not as shitty as going to hell. So even though you're enslaving them, you're giving them the gospel. And that's the same freaking logic of, yeah, some kids are going to die, but when they die, they get to go to heaven because of you. Never mind that Uganda is a heavily Christianized nation in a lot of ways. And so it's not like they don't have the gospel already. It's just falls into this same kind of civilized versus uncivilized kind of thing that's been going. And your story is just totally feeds into that. This poor little Muslim child, he doesn't even have a real life until we, the benevolent white benefactors, grant it to him.
And save him. Yeah, it was a hymn. Okay. And save him. And and you can go to the archives of Princeton Seminary and read all of these sermons given by early presidents of Princeton Seminary, talking about how lucky slaves have it, and using the passage about slaves obey your masters, and it's that same thing. Yeah, maybe slavery is a little crappy, but they've now been rescued from dark paganism, and they are going to go to heaven. And not even to mention or completely have no knowledge of the fact, right? And we talked about this the other day, that there's this incredibly rich history of indigenous Christianity in Africa that the Europeans completely ignored, still kind of ignore to this very day. But yeah, we're saving all these people. And a few decades of a crappy life is nothing compared to the glory of eternity.
This to me raises a bunch of questions, but one of them, I remember, so I wrote a book called The Unkingdom. This is my little plug for that book. And the first chapter, I talk basically the crappy history of Christian conquest. And in it, I kind of come down unfavorably about the idea of most missions. And right after the first edition of the book came out, I got to do a little bit of radio interviews. And since the publisher was evangelical, it was with evangelical radio stations. And they were like, you're being unfair to missions, right? Somehow I'm just out to get missionaries. Never mind the fact I've kind of been one. But it raises this question, is it even possible for white European or American people to proclaim the gospel in any real way in the so-called developing world? And if so, what does it look like?
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Because the reality is, it looks a lot more like this Rene Bach unwittingly causing vast harm to families than it does towards any sort of like, in my mind, like if I'm being honest here, I feel like missions looks more like Che Guevara going to Africa, like inside, it's some sort of message of liberation of some sort. Not that I'm a big fan of Guevara in every way. But to me, like what I see when it comes to even development agencies is nothing like liberation. It's a type of like bondage. So what does it even mean for us as Christians? Maybe it's easy for us to be like, this Rene Bach, what a shitbird. Like, what is it like? What is it that we are? What's our alternative vision? Because the United States, even if it's not involved in missions work, there's all sorts of agencies with its fingers all over in the rest of the world. All kinds of.
Yeah, and even on the simplest level, right, of just money for mission trips, and I mean, this is something I really struggled with as a pastor. And, we went on a couple of mission trips. We did the first international mission trip that our church, the Crookston Church, had ever done. We went to Costa Rica, and, these trips, right, you raise thousands of dollars to pay for the white people to go to these places. Sure, you leave some money there, you bring some percentage of that for the people there, but it's mostly for us. And yeah, there's a big question in my mind of, wouldn't it be far better to just raise all that money and put it in an envelope and send it to that place? That might be a better mission trip. There's certainly, I think, some benefit for some people in terms of widening perspective. I mean, a lot of these folks that went on this trip had never been out of the country. Some of them had never been out of the state of Minnesota. And their worldview is expanded, and that was definitely worth something. And the things we did were very simple, and I would say certainly not harmful. But still, I think on balance, if we'd written one check and just mailed it there, in terms of the good we did in that particular village, that might have been a far better thing to do.
It's interesting because, like, I totally agree that there's an expansion of awareness and consciousness that happens with travel, but I've often seen it pushed so far that people saying like these dumb rural American types or like uneducated folks can't even understand the world outside where they live unless they travel, which is funny because until like well into my adulthood, I'd never even left this country at all. And so I'm an example of a relatively untraveled person. And I've met all sorts of well-traveled pricks. Right. Because, you can get confirmation bias all sorts of places.
No, absolutely.
But so there's the truth of what you're saying. And it's also true that like a lot of people travel internationally and they're like, oh man, I've got it great. Look at those sad, shabby people.
Yep.
There's a lot of that happens. Got a few comments coming in.
So you've made Phoebe's day here.
Yeah, you don't even have to attribute that to me. Dangling threads of shittiness is my new favorite phrase. I'm happy to contribute to your personal lexicon. Kathleen writes, reminds me of the movie where Sandra Bullock wins an Oscar for playing the part of a white woman who saves a black boy by raising him in a white neighborhood and allowing him to play football, the accepted path for black men. The Blind Side.
Yes,
that movie,
Blind Side. Yeah. And we talk about this sort of missionary porn, right? Where you'll see the lovely looking blonde white chick, surrounded by all the black little kids, smiling and, oh, isn't it great? I get to be with these, little black kids and helping them on my mission trip. And, Facebook is full of that, and Instagram full of that kind of stuff.
I don't want to get into it now, but sometime remind me. If Oren were watching, this would be hilarious because he went to South America to be a part of a film crew for this woman who was traveling around calling herself Jungle Barbie, this really blonde, very attractive young woman going and like trying to help people. So this is, and then it was not even from a Christian perspective. So this sort of weird white imperialism exists in all kinds of ways. Patricia writes, missions in my mind is about relationship building, not just giving money. I mean, at the very least, whatever we think of as missions, any sort of sharing of any good news, it can't be transactional. At the very least.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and what you very rarely, I would say, see is the idea of, I go on this trip starting from the point of view that I don't know anything. I don't know anything about these people. I don't know anything about these places. And the only thing that I'm going to do is maybe learn a tiny amount. Right. And I've talked to people who've gone on, 2-week trips, and they're mad. They're like, well, I didn't really get to help. I didn't really get to do anything. Like, we just like sat around and talked to people. And I'm just like, on a 2-week trip, you don't know enough about anything to be able to help these people. You just know enough to do some damage. And so it's good that you didn't do anything for 2 weeks. And and people just don't get that. They just don't get that.
I mean, I've done all sorts of, like, I remember in high school, we went on a missions trip to Tijuana, and a bunch of us dumb rural white kids are sent out to do like these, like, because we don't know the language, so we're doing a mime evangelism. I'm not even making that up. And I saw so many, and we'd hand out tracts in Spanish, and so many people got upset at us, and I was like, "Why? We're here to help them." And I'm like, and then it was only later I realized, damn, like, almost everybody in Mexico is a Christian. How condescending is it to do that? And I wish that were my only evangelistic experience. I've done dozens of things like that where I've led people to Jesus, but then in retrospect realized how foolish and reckless it was. Leah writes, what saving needs to happen anyway? Share the wealth, deal with our own many problems, reparations first. I think the impulse is to avoid changing ourselves, even though that would do the most good.
Yeah. Well, and so, what this points to is the great theological conundrum of what is the gospel and what is salvation anyway. And so again, if your view of this is this narcissistic view of, I have the key to this eternal good place. By the way, that's my pitch for The Good Place. If you haven't seen that show, it's awesome. The Good Place.
The further it goes, the more it gets a little bit lost in the weeds, but
yeah, it's fun. Yeah. So I have the key to this eternal good place. And if you don't listen to me, you go to the eternal bad place, right? Then, of course that saving needs to happen. And it comes through me. And I'm so awesome that I'm doing this for these poor unwashed masses. And and that's the thing about narcissism. There's no self-reflection that maybe you're actually just insane. And that doesn't happen. No.
Gus writes, similar things happen, in my opinion, with nearly every city mission. My org's founder says, and I think he's right, that most evangelized people in the U.S. are the chronically unhoused. It's true. It's based on my experience. A lot of them know their Bible pretty well, have an amazing faith. I could go off on this and almost become Rage Mark if I let myself, which I know would make Dan happy. But
it would.
So, we did hospitality in several houses for years, and I'd always get people wanting to come send their youth to help us out with stuff. And I'm like, no, because like we're just 3 households of people, and like a third of us are people experiencing some form of homelessness, and they're not a project. Like, they're people we have a relationship with, and we're trying to do mutuality. So seeing them as a mission field made zero sense. And people would get angry at me for not letting them, and then say, well, why? How can you expect to raise money unless you give people experiences? I'm like, we need money for helping with these things. And if you need to have an experience to give us money, then I don't want your money. And people thought I was just being arrogant because they couldn't understand that I was just advocating for just regular humanity. They'd also want me to come to their church and tell stories about transformation of homeless people's lives. I'm like, That's not my story to tell. It's their story to tell. I'm not going to do that.
Well, and even that phrase that you just used, right? Give people experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the commodification and capitalization of life, right? That life is just a series of chunks of experiences that you get and collect and now put on social media. And that's what life is about, right? Making memories and giving experiences. And that is a completely alienated, dehumanized approach to anything, but certainly to Christianity.
That's right. Julia says, wow, that entitlement has a long reach. They help themselves to our eternity too.
Absolutely. A little entitlement goes a long way.
CK writes, Sally Struthers in South Park. Is that a particular episode? I know the Sally Struthers, the commercial. That was a doozy. It's been a while since I've seen it, though. I'm assuming South Park rips on that. Kevin writes, seems we as privileged Americans have more to learn from the poor than they have to learn from us. I mean, at the very least, we've got to work our way into mutuality. And there's not a lot of mutuality to go around.
Yeah, I mean, just even the notion that we have something to learn from each other is sadly a pretty radical notion.
This.
Thank you.
Thank you. Julia writes, growing up in a neighborhood that was ground zero for every kind of mission trip, I experienced them as a form of violence as they tried to save us from ourselves. Amen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. We're not the zoo for social tourism. No. I mean, I remember, so I grew up right near White Earth Reservation, and I wish I could time travel back because I had no idea that badass people like Winona LaDuke were there. I saw it as this dark, we talked about it. We were a part of these different charismatic and Pentecostal churches in the area, and we saw the reservation as a dark place and would go to the pray. And I remember coming to Minneapolis to do evangelism, prayer evangelism, which is where you pray against demons rather than talk to anybody, which is weird. And we were going to these urban neighborhoods, and we were driving through the suburbs, and I looked out and I realized, and this is the first time I had this idea, if we're going to where the demons are, why aren't we in the suburbs? And it's it blew my mind open. I'm like, I think these people have everything exactly backwards. And that's the case. I still I go up and I hear from people about how much the reservations are in demonic bondage. That kind of way of talking.
Yeah. Well, and there's a Presbyterian church on one of the reservations outside of Devil's Lake in North Dakota, and this church has been going on for a very long time, and all these white folks come there for mission trips and various things. And, even after all these years, they hardly know any people. They just show up, do stuff, pat themselves on the back and leave. They don't have any relationships with any of these folks. And it's a very alienated, toxic, weird dynamic that's going on there. But again, from the white church perspective, this is the most awesome thing ever.
Mm-hmm. White Jesus tourism. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Leah's with the Catholic Workers, so thanks for that, Mark. Totally my experience too at the Catholic Worker. And just to be transparent, Catholic worker communities are some of the most radical Christian groups around, but they always we talk about this sort of problem all the time, this sort of condescension between host and guest and how do you transform relationships. There's no real easy way to deal with this because the power dynamic is always there and you can't just act like it's not. So anytime you want to share or give anything to somebody else and you have more power than them, this problem is going to sweep in, and working towards real mutuality is hard, especially in our system, which I cannot divest myself of my power because it is granted to me from outside myself. And so this is always a challenge and always a problem. And I wish that people could just be more comfortable talking about this stuff instead of getting all defensive as shit about it, which is what usually happens. I had a good run, by the way, for a while before people really knew where I was coming from. I'd get invited to speak to groups like a YWAM group in Canada, InterVarsity group in Mexico, and I'd always roll out my anti-empire missions is colonialism talk and kind of blow up people, and then they would not invite me back. But it was like I had my one chance.
Got your shot.
I had my shot. Kevin Trent writes, I'd like to hear more about your idea of missionary work as liberatory work. What do you think of accompaniment?
Yeah. See, and to me, from the spiritual life and practice point of view, this has got to start with ourselves. And so, if we're white people in America and we're not doing our spiritual work of completely unforming and allowing ourselves to be reformed, it's very hard to even start to talk about going and doing something with somebody else, because the question is what are the perspectives that you are doing that from. And I was down leading a retreat in Missouri shortly after Ferguson, and and there were all these white pastors in there that were like, well, we want to do something, we want to go to Ferguson and do something, we want to. And of course, we're seeing this here at the corner with George Floyd, all these white Christians showing up. We talked about that in one episode, wanting to do something. And I said, look, you think as a white person that you're going to do something cool. And a lot of the black folks here, they can just see your pointy hats from a mile away. And that kind of blew things up for a few moments right there. But
I mean, we could have a whole multiple episodes about this one question alone. Like, to me, accompaniment is a good model, but like, I've done some stuff with Christian peacemaker teams, which uses an accompaniment model, and have friends who work there, and this stuff always seeps in, and there's almost like this trajectory. First, you start out realizing you're just treating them like a mission field, and it's kind of condescending. And then you have there's all these movies about the white teacher who goes into the urban area, and they're the ones who learn a life lesson, but it's still centered on their experience. That's like the next step. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's like, okay, it's still about you learning. And it's kind of a weird narcissism. And then you have to move into some sort of real mutuality. And to me, this is where the spiritual life is important, because I think it's problematic if we assume we have a message that has to be shared with them. Right. Model is toxic. But what it needs to be happening is we need to go into be in discernment with people to see how we can work together towards shared liberation. Okay, so to me, this is where even as a white dude talking about police abolition and the struggle for Black lives, I have to do that from a framework of understanding that somehow my liberation is tied up in that in a non-trite way, and that has to be concerned.
And even just starting this on the smallest level, I'm dealing with this every day, being 2 blocks away from the George Floyd site, right? So we are having these neighborhood meetings that are all white people talking about what is going to happen with them up at the corner, talking about all the things they're hearing about the Black gangs at the corner. I'm the only person that's actually gone and talked to any of those Black people. And everybody's like, oh my God, this has happened, that's happening. I've heard this rumor, that rumor. I'm like, well, have you ever gone and talked to any of them? Oh, no, they're a gang. I'm like, well, I just went and talked to them yesterday, and this is what they told me is going on. And so we make things very complicated where we as privileged people are trying to avoid actually doing the basic work. Right. And it, in some ways, it'd be very, very simple. Right? Did you actually ever go talk to somebody? Did you actually go talk to them from the perspective that you guys are equal people, you're people in the world trying to get by, dealing with all kinds of different shit. Not from the point of view of, right, I have something more than you have. Are you doing a mission trip to the suburbs, assuming that you're trying to exorcise them of their demons?
I'd love to
Right?
see some of
Like,
that.
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that would be awesome, right? And that would also get you kicked out of your suburban church if you tried to suggest that. So I guess that's my feeling about accompaniment. Like if once your suburban church starts doing the mission trip to yourself to exorcise yourself of your demons, of your capitalist demons, then you could talk about other kinds of accompaniments, maybe.
I thought of doing an action where people dressed up in suits with little signs that, and standing in front of one of those gated communities, saying, "Let these rich people out of their white ghettos." Something like that would have been very fun. But like this is the thing. This is the problem. So much money is tied up in this stuff. It's just like the nonprofit industrial complex in general. You have to do stuff in order to get the money. And if you don't get the money, then you can't have a job and pay everybody. And so like it's almost impossible to fundraise around. We need to divest ourselves of our white power. And so our missions trip is going to be to the suburbs to try to figure out how to like challenge white supremacy. Like you can't fundraise that.
No, I used to, for a number of years, was doing spiritual direction at these massive youth ministry conferences. And they had the exhibit hall, this entire exhibit hall full of mission organizations, trips, looking just like, a medical convention, right? Fancy banners, cool stuff, all the merch, all the pictures, all of this. I told Mike Iaconelli, I said, I think that's what Rome looked like to Paul when he showed up there. He wasn't happy about that. All right, we're over time, so let's just roll through the rest of our great comments.
Series writes, a lot of missions in college operate with saviorism trash. The transactional nature of missions creates insecure attachments and codependency instead of healthy interdependence and exchange. Amen. Well stated.
All right. Yes.
CK writes, being homeless taught me more about compassion and humanity than anything I've experienced in my life.
No,
not bad. Series writes, it also reinforces irresponsibility and obligation-driven actions. Yeah. Franklin Graham. Kathleen writes, Franklin Graham has something called Operation Shoebox, where white people send boxes of American crap to children in other countries to celebrate Christmas. Totally narcissistic.
Totally narcissistic and economically destructive, right? So evangelical churches in America routinely are destroying local economies and artisans by sending our excess crap to these places for free, and now local artisans are out of jobs. I'm not sure what that's saving, other than
at least they got a Barbie and a Tinker Toys or whatever.
Well, and a lot of that stuff is like the championship T-shirts and hats of the teams that lose. They send all that crap to Africa. It's unbelievable.
Julie writes, yes, please learn to accompany yourself first. Then you might have something to offer us besides material crumbs. And you may figure out we have something to offer you too. A two-way street.
Amen.
Amen. We're well past time. This has been rich and kind of frustrating episode to talk about, because it raises so many more questions. Because people still, like, I've had conversations like this a bunch of times. People are like, well, what is the gospel and how do I share it? It's got to be about me being important, doing something. Because I can't just sit here and do nothing. What's the point of living? Like that kind of, like, you need to go deeper on that and see like how you can divest yourself of that anxiety. I'll say that, Daniel. Economically destructive is all get out. And then Gus writes, the U.S. is having a trade war over secondhand goods in Rwanda over the last 3 years. This is just, as you can see with these comments, it's just scratching the surface of a pile of nasty.
A big giant pile of doo-doo.
Yeah.
Which we'll continue with.
Yeah, some other time.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
See y'all tomorrow,
Great to
everybody.
see you, hear from you. Bye.
Bye.